Every year in April, people in the United States of America celebrate National Arab Heritage Month to recognize the contribution and influences of Arab Americans to the history, culture, and achievement of America. The mission of our channel is to spread the philosophical ideas that have gone unnoticed by both the academia and the general public. So in aligning ourselves with the mission of our goal to spread knowledge and untap wisdom that has been developed over millennia, we would like to take this moment to commemorate the role that the Arab philosophers have played in shaping the Arab American communities and their immense influence on the world history. In this video, we will first begin by studying the works of Abu Yusuf Yaqub bin Ishaq al-Sabah al-Kindi, the first of the Islamic peripatetic philosophers and hailed as the father of the Arab philosophy. Although Arabic replaced Pahlavi, the ancient Persian language, and Greek in the 7th to 8th century under Islam's first dynasty known as the Umayyads, administrative and scholarly language of the Islamic Empire, it is by no means that philosophy written in the Arabic language expressive of a specific Arabic worldview. There were also Persian, Syrians, Berbers, Africans, and Indians and Turks among numerous Islamic philosophers, and some philosophers wrote in languages other than Arabic depending on their ethnicity. Furthermore, Arabic philosophy is a philosophy that begins with rendering Greek philosophy into the Arabic language, and many who did these renditions were Christian like Hanyan bin Isha and his son Abu Bishr Matta or Yahya bin Adi, all three of whom were pivotal figures in the Baghdad peripatetic movement of the 10th century. There were also intersections between Jewish and Islamic philosophers from the 9th and 10th century, like Isaac Israeli and Saadia Guan. Last but not least, certain philosophers like Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, and Averroes were more interesting in finding the truth and continuing the Greek tradition than developing Islamic thought and furthering the religious agenda. So the term Arabic philosophy is about a philosophical tradition that has its origin in the translation movement and encompasses many different types of people with varying motives. So it is more accurate to call it Arabic philosophy rather than Islamic philosophy. And as we go forward, we'll be taking a look at philosophy written in Arabic and pay attention to the motives and procedures of this movement. To truly appreciate a philosophical tradition and see a distinction from other traditions as well as understand the thinkers involved in this movement, we first need to understand the history behind the development of the tradition. During the imperial age, in many centers of the Roman world, philosophy was taught in close connection to the doctrine of great philosophers of the past. But other things changed when Roman Emperor closed down the philosophy schools because the population and political body regarded non-Christian thoughts as paganistic and sinful. In 489 CE, the Byzantine Emperor closed the Edessa school, and in 529 CE, Emperor Justinian closed down the Platonic school in the Athenian Academy. Simplicius, Damascus, and many other philosophers fled Athens and went to Persia to the court of Croesus I, where they remained until 532 CE and resumed their activity. So Greek philosophy flourished in Muslim land and was concentrated in Iran and Central Asia for the next several centuries. This was by no means the first penetration of Greek philosophy in the Arab land. Hundreds of years before, the Sasanian emperor was deeply interested in philosophy, so he sponsored many Neoplatonic philosophers to join him in Ctesiphon. Another center of Greek philosophy was Mistorian School in Nisbi, founded by the bishop Barsalma. Also was Syrianus, the teacher of Proclus, the famed Greek Neoplatonist philosopher and one of the last major classical philosophers. He developed a full-fledged curriculum of philosophical studies, which included both Aristotle and Plato. Studying Aristotle was as a preliminary in these new curriculums, which would guide students from logic to physics to metaphysics, and the subsequent exposition of supreme theological truth. Abu Yusuf Yaqub ibn Ishaq al-Sabah al-Kindi was an Arabic Muslim philosopher, polymath, mathematician, physician, and musician. He became a prominent figure in the House of Wisdom, and a number of Abbasid caliphs appointed him to oversee the translation of Greek scientific and philosophical texts into the Arabic language. His contact with the philosophy of the ancient is an Arab reference to the Greek and Roman thinkers, had a great influence on him, as he synthesized, adapted, and promoted Hellenistic and peripatetic philosophy in the Muslim world. He wrote 100 of original treatises of his own on many different subjects ranging from metaphysics, ethics, logic, and psychology, to medicine, pharmacology, mathematics, astronomy, and optics. In the field of mathematics, Al-Kindi, along with Al-Khwarizmi, was pivotal in introducing Indian numerals to the Islamic world and subsequently relabeled as Arabic numerals to the Christian world. He is also one of the fathers of cryptography, as he wrote manuscripts on deciphering cryptographic messages, which would give rise to the birth of cryptanalysis, something we still rely upon in the modern technological world. Using his mathematical and medical expertise, he was also able to develop a scale that would allow doctors to quantify the potency of their medication. Despite the important role he occupied in introducing philosophy to the Muslim intellectuals, his philosophical output was overshadowed by that of Al-Farabi. Now, very few of his texts are available for us to examine, and the ones that remain are only a single manuscript. Among Al-Kindi's most historically significant work is the Brief on the Intellect. In his published work, the Anima translated as On the Soul, Al-Kindi presents the theory that there is a separate, immaterial, first intellect which is not identified with gods, but is just an entity that is always thinking about all the universals. It reflects his understanding of Aristotle's theory of intellect, where they believe that individual human intellects are distinct from the first intellect. They start out in potency, that is with the ability to grasp universal concepts, but this ability is realized only when the first intellect makes our potential intellect become actual. In other words, makes the human intellect actually think about given universal concept. Why can't human intellect reach these concepts on their own, without the help of the first intellect, some may ask? Al-Kindi's answer is that just as wood is potentially hot, it needs something actually hot, such as fire, to actualize that potential hotness, so the intellect that is only thinking about something needs a cause to make it actually think. In other words, the first intellect is that cause that must actually be thinking about the same concept, just as fire must actually be hot to cause heat. Once this has happened, the concept is stored in one's mental library, which Al-Kindi calls the acquired intellect, and from this point on, one can think about it whenever one wishes. Unlike other great thinkers, both ancient and contemporaries, Al-Kindi does not much invoke the technical distinction between different kinds of intellect. But the important distinction made in his work shows that Al-Kindi does not think that humans can obtain general or universal concepts directly from sense perception. He thinks it is not possible to acquire the universal concept of a table just by looking at a single table, or going to the IKEA and looking at different tables. When a person looks at a table, Al-Kindi thinks that a person only receives a sensible form, in other words, the visual representation of a table. This distinction from the purely immaterial concept that is kind of a table, which Al-Kindi also calls a form, is rather a universal form. This belief is reflected by Aristotle in puristic epistemology, by saying that we do learn about the world by receiving sensible forms through our bodily organs. But it also reflects Neoplatonic epistemology at the same time, accepting the idea that there is a separate intellect that is always thinking about all universal forms, and humans come to understand these forms by having a certain relationship with that separate intellect. This theory of knowledge, or epistemology, is the foundation of Al-Kindi's treatment of the soul, which Al-Kindi says is a simple substance, immaterial and related to the material world only by having faculties that are exercised through the body, echoing Plato's Phaedo and alluding to the Pythagoreanism and the theology of Aristotle. Al-Kindi stresses that these faculties, both the irascible and desiring faculties, can lead to the soul astray and plunge it further into association with the body. The role of the human soul is to concentrate on its intellectual aspect, and after death, it joins a purely intelligible world, a world where all true forms exist. Our souls can move on to the world because they are not attached to our body. So the death of our bodies does not mean the death of our souls. In other words, as an immaterial and simple substance, our souls are immortal. His major ethical work on the art of dispelling sorrows emphasizes this dichotomy of sensible form from intellectual forms. It is impossible for someone to attain everything he seeks, or to keep all the things he loves safe from loss, because stability and permanence are not existence in the world of generations and corruptions we inhabit. Necessarily, stability and permanence exist only in the world of the intellect. Al-Kindi synthesized different strands of ancient thought by combining a Stoic idea that we should not base our happiness on things in the impermanent physical world with a Neoplatonic idea that we should only value what is permanent, which only exists in the intellectual world with its immaterial, universal forms. So Al-Kindi echoes the same Greek sentiments that philosophy itself is the highest good for mankind. For philosophy is a study of universal forms and takes us away from our desires for the transient things of this world. The afterlife that he envisions is simply a philosopher's version of paradise. Al-Kindi, however, believes that we should abandon our pursuit of empirical scientific knowledge, because knowledge of the sensible world, the world that we live, allows us to study Allah indirectly. As he says, in things evident to the senses, there is a most manifest indication of God and His providence. Thus he penned a large amount of work to deal with physical sciences, but much has been lost, and only his work on cosmology and optics have been preserved.